So good afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome you here to the University of Chicago. I'm Jeffrey Stacker, the director of the Chicago Center for Jewish Studies and associate professor of Hebrew Bible in the Divinity School. It's a real pleasure to welcome you to today's lecture with our distinguished guest, Eva Hoffman. Our colleague Božena Shellcross will do the formal introduction for our speaker in a moment, but before turning the podium over to her, I want to alert you to a few upcoming Jewish Studies events that will be happening this fall on campus. One is the celebration of the completion of the Zohar Pritzker edition translation that will occur on October 16th, beginning at 3 p.m. in the Swift third floor lecture hall. This promises to be a really interesting event with a panel discussion of faculty, with lectures, and so put this on your calendar at 3 p.m. On October 16th. And then also the Autumn Greenberg Lecture, which will be delivered by visiting Professor Chaim Gantz of Tel Aviv University. The title of his lecture will be Jews, Palestinians, and Israel, 3 historiographies, 3 moralities, 3 roadmaps. It will take place on November 2nd, also in the Swift third floor lecture hall at 4:30 p.m. These are just a taste of the wonderful lineup of events we have planned for this academic year, and I hope that you will be able to attend many of them with us. So keep an eye out for the emails, the announcements. Our fearless administrator, Nancy Pardee, who's standing back by the door, she really does a fantastic job of making sure that we know everything that's going on, and it's really a lot of things. And so my thanks to Nancy for all of her coordination. We want to dedicate this event to the memory of one of our students, Mare O'Brien, a rising third-year student in the college who was majoring in religious studies and died tragically September 2nd, having been diagnosed with cancer only a couple months before. I had the privilege of teaching Mare last year in my Introduction to the Hebrew Bible course here in the university. He was a wonderful student. Those of you who knew him, no doubt, know that what I'm saying is true. He was smart and curious. He saw deeply into the material that we examined. He was very generous. He was kind. I enjoyed sitting so much with Mare during my office hours, talking about the details of his work. We talked about his ideas and his ambitions. His smile lit up the room, and I will always remember fondly his easy laugh and gentle spirit. And so it's a great honor for us to dedicate this event to his memory. With that, I turn over the podium to my colleague, Božena Shellcross.
Thank you. I also had the privilege to be Mayor O'Brien's teacher, and I am also very saddened by his certainly tragic and too early departure. But on a more cheerful note, I want to introduce Professor Dr. Eva Hoffman, and it is always a great pleasure that I am introducing her tonight. She is a renowned writer whose essays belong to the best tradition of Michel Montaigne's meditations. What's a better way of introducing the writer than through her books? And if so, I would start with her first book, the lucid and eloquent prose of her debut book, Lost in Translation, Alive in a New Language, catapulted her, then the senior editor of the New York Times Book Review, onto the international stage. For Hoffman, the emotional prism of the émigré experience produced a reflective nostalgia that defied an easy cultural assimilation, while enhancing her inner observations of the old Polish identity being replaced by a new one. Next came Exit into History, a journey through the new Eastern Europe. A vivid portrayal combining her two travels through the regions in newly liberated countries, newly liberated, of course, from the Soviet Union's domination, originating in Poland and concluding in Bulgaria. This unlikely travelogue is mostly executed through numerous exchanges with local dissidents, friends, or cultural figures about ideas, politics, past and future, amidst the consequences of the systemic change. Her volume Shtetl, The Life and Death of a Small Town and the World of Polish Jews, an informal yet very informative monograph of a little town called WRONGS, located in northeastern Poland, is enhanced by a historical backdrop of the Jewish diaspora on the Polish land. The former Shtetl, WRONGS, and its dead and largely forgotten Jewish inhabitants and their traces haunt the book's pages like bygone specters that they had indeed become. Yet Shtetl is not a melancholy return to the lost past, but a work of a clear purpose. It was written to reflect on the Polish-Jewish relations and to combat some ossified stereotypes into which the complex truth of the Polish-Jewish coexistence has turned out to be. It seems almost logical that Shtetl was followed by, after such knowledge, memory, history, and legacy of the Holocaust. A personal meditation on the Holocaust trauma transferred by the survivors, transferred to the survivors' children. Eva Hoffman, a child of Polish-Jewish Holocaust survivors, does a remarkable labor of mourning by processing her own memories onto a large landscape of the second generation's responsibilities and inherited trauma. While some scholars claim, for various reasons, that the living memory of the Holocaust is about to end due to its trivialization, Hollywoodization, this is the approach of Alvin Rosenfeld, or because of the more predictable last survivors passing away, this is the approach of Susan Gruber. Hoffman's sense of the second generation's guardianship of the difficult legacy speaks of preserving the scarred memory in its transferred but paradoxically authentic sphere. Time, Big Ideas, Small Books is a splendid little essay written by the author who attentively recreates one's immersion in time. Its measured, if not calm, narrative leads naturally to another one of her works. Just last year, Hoffman published a formidable defense of boredom in her book, How to be Bored, in which her unhurried voice restores the culture of slowness and even idleness as the condition for reflection. It is, after all, the culture of Eastern Europe, co-created among others by Józef Brodski, Andrzej Tarkowski, and Krzysztof Kieślowski. Interspersed with these writings are her two novels, The Secret and Illuminations. In her books, there is always present a particular aspect of her mind. Eva Hoffman is both a skillful and a natural-born dialectician who refrains from the simple to cultivate the consciousness complexities, to process differences. Yet, this intellectual daughter of Freud simultaneously opts for in her own words, the shared world. Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you for that really generous introduction. I only hope I can live up to it. It's really a great pleasure to be here in this beautiful, cozy room on this beautiful campus, and a great honor to have been invited to give this inaugural lecture for the Center of Jewish Studies. So thank you for that as well. So today I want to just give a few reflections on the long aftermath of the Holocaust and the position and the role of the second generation in thinking about it today, particularly today. As we're all aware, the generation of actual survivors is reaching the end of its lifespan. The heritage of the Holocaust is being passed on to generations which are increasingly removed from the actual experience or even informed knowledge of the dark event. And so there are real questions about how to transmit not only the facts but the meanings of this overwhelming history in this history-altering event 7 decades later. And what kind of understanding or knowledge or even wisdom we can derive from it or bring to it from our perspective. At the same time, even as our temporal distance from the Holocaust lengthens, such questions are once again acquiring a new urgency in the current political climate, as anti-Semitism and other forms of prejudice are becoming legitimized in various ways, and as Holocaust denial, I must say to my entire astonishment, is once again treated as a credible proposition by a large number of younger people, particularly the followers of the so-called historian David Irving, who boasts that he has inspired a new generation of Holocaust skeptics. In the age of the internet and in the post-truth era, it is increasingly important and increasingly difficult to preserve historical truth and to understand it in all its complexity. In this task, the second generation, both the actual descendants of survivors and the wider post-war, post-Holocaust generation, is the generation which now carries the wand of transmission and of continuing to reckon with this difficult legacy. But I will begin in medias res with a recent moment which made all of these questions immediately vivid to me. In November 2015, 2 years ago, I was in Bratislava, the capital of the new country of Slovakia, attending the annual conference of something called the Central European Forum, a lively platform for Eastern European international discussion of democracy established by Václav Havel, one of the most humane architects of the Eastern European Velvet Revolutions. On the evening of November 12th, I was engaged in a discussion with Bernard Schling, the author of the internationally acclaimed novel The Reader, about our attempts to come to terms as members of the post-war second generation with our respective personal and collective pasts. His as a descendant of a German generation responsible for what were surely the worst atrocities in human history. Mine as a daughter of Holocaust survivors. Our discussion was sometimes difficult, but charged with mutual understanding and with respect of each other's attempts to understand and reckon with the inheritance bequeathed to us by the Shoah. We were, in a way, part of a larger dialogue between Jews and Germans which had been going on in the last 1 or 2 decades, a dialogue which I think has been reparative on both sides. The next morning, on coming down from my hotel room, I was greeted by the terrible tidings of the Bataclan attacks in Paris. As I'm sure you all remember, these were the terror attacks on a concert hall and other locations, in which 130 people died. The young host observed me sympathetically as I tried not to break into tears on hearing the news. As it happened, there was a television discussion scheduled that morning for several of the forum's participants. And of course, whatever the initial subject, it was overshadowed by what had just taken place in Paris. The conversation, however, soon turned not so much to the specific threat posed by terrorism as to the threatened nature of democracy itself. How have European democracies become so weak, the host asked, and how can they be strengthened? And how do you feel after the attack? He probed. Do you feel afraid? I said no, afraid, but I felt a sense of deep outrage and a kind of mourning, and both were infused with a sense of a strange haunting by something experienced much earlier. The present had intruded on us with an urgency which made the past seem, well, like the past, but at the same time with a sense, if not of repetition, then of a strange conflation and an echo. And I must say I felt an eerie sense of repetition yesterday morning as I woke up in the hotel room to the news of the horror of Las Vegas. But I think the stereoscopic perspective is often characteristic of second-generation perceptions, and that it is that perspective and the particular distance at which we stand from the Holocaust which gives us our task, but also our opportunity to make a particular contribution to thinking about that history-altering event. Hold on for a second, I'm going to... And so I want to begin by trying to decode the nature of that distance and our relationship to the events which preceded us. I want to begin with my personal story because that is where that relationship for the literal children of survivors begins. I grew up in Poland after the war, and like many children who came into the world in its close aftermath, I felt that, in a sense, I came from the war, that this enormous upheaval was my true origin, indeed a kind of origin of the world. The signs and scars of destruction were everywhere visible, in the ruined cities, in men with missing limbs, in the orphaned children whose faces emanated a great sadness. Between 1939 and 1945, Poland was the epicenter not of one, but two violent upheavals. The Nazi war of occupation and conquest against the Poles, in which 3 million people lost their lives, and the project of extermination directed against the Jews and perpetrated largely on Polish territory, in which 3 million Polish Jews, or 90% of the pre-war Jewish population in Poland, were murdered. Before I understood these events in their full historical reality, both cataclysms were for me a potent and deeply formative psychic inheritance. Even if I didn't know about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the invasion of the Nazis by the Nazis from the West and Soviets from the East, I understood the fierceness of patriotic feelings which attached to the idea of resistance, of which Poland had a long and melancholy history. I understood the solidarity of opposition which united us against them, that is, the Soviet-sponsored regime by which Poles felt so deeply betrayed. I remember clustering around the radio with our neighbors to listen behind tightly closed doors to illicit Radio Free Europe broadcasts, so as to get actual news of the world instead of the official version, which everyone understood to be entirely mendacious. But there was also the other legacy, transmitted in our small family and in low-voiced conversations between people who had lived through almost unspeakable, almost unimaginable events. My parents had survived the Holocaust against nearly impossible odds in a small rural town in what was then the Polish part of the Ukraine. Their lives were saved by Polish and Ukrainian neighbors who were risking their own lives to shelter them, but their entire families were exterminated in that violent vicinity. This compressed palette of facts was my first knowledge, and it's no exaggeration to say that it took me half a lifetime to unpack it and understand its contents. I had grown up so close to my parents' anguish so as to mistake it for my own. I felt I knew the attic in which they were hidden, and that I knew my mother's sister, whose death she mourned almost daily. It was easy to mistake their memories for mine, but actually they weren't my memories. What I felt and absorbed instead were the emotional consequences of their experiences, which are so easily transmitted to a child's psyche. The hunger, the huddled hiding, the mourning for their close ones, or my father's daring feats of escape. This transmission is very deep and has very long-term consequences, and there is now new research being done on epigenetic transmission of experience, really. So it seems that, you know, certain powerful events can alter a person's genes in adult life, and that this genetic alteration can be passed on to the offspring. So there is this very profound transmission of traumatic experience. But eventually I felt that in order to grasp the nature of my parents' experiences, I needed to understand not only the particular facts of their stories, but the wider context in which they took place. The movements of Soviet and Nazi armies in Eastern Europe, for example, or the shifting alliances among various powers, or the patterns of relations among neighbors in the tricultural area, Polish, Jewish, and Ukrainian, where they lived, and how these were affected by the progress of that awful war. In other words, in order to understand even my family's particular trajectory, I had to move from personal story and family memory to history. I stress this because we too easily speak of the memory of the Holocaust not only among children of survivors, but among the wider, Jewish population, as if, it gave us an automatic understanding of this event and sometimes a basis for identity. But collective memory is not really memory. It is a strong attachment to a shared past, to a shared significant past. It's an assertion of a strong attachment to that past. However, what many of us who grew up in close proximity to survivors do inherit is an emotionally potent relationship to the Holocaust and a close awareness of its human meanings, of the enormous suffering it entailed and its long aftermath, of the delicacy involved in living with people who are greatly victimized, but whose agency and sense of responsibility needs to be preserved and respected, and indeed of the resilience shown by many in their later lives. The Holocaust is a powerful moral and affective education. At the same time, our temporal and affective distance from that event enables us to do something which could not be expected of most survivors themselves, and that is to place the 6 years of horror and atrocity within a longer history, and also to bring to it a perspective informed by the subsequent 70 years, with all the information this delivers about other forms of collective violence. For most survivors, their own terrible experiences covered the entire horizon of their perceptions. It would have been very difficult for someone whose relative died, say, as a result of being informed on by a Polish neighbor, to acknowledge or even to know that there were also networks within Poland trying to save Jewish lives. Nor could survivors be expected to place their experiences in a historical or cross-cultural context, to compare, for example, Polish behavior during the war to the behavior of the Dutch in relation to the Jews, or to consider whether there were any long-term cultural or historical factors which affected what happened in each country. And the comparison between the Dutch and the Poles may be surprising to many of you. The rate of help and the rate of people who saved Jews in Amsterdam was very similar to the rate of those who saved people in Warsaw. I mean, Warsaw, of course, was not the rest of Poland, but it is a surprising bit of information. But for Holocaust survivors, possibly the very idea of placing such experiences in context in their immediate aftermath would have seemed indecent. And so most people who had lived through the Holocaust thought about it mostly in terms of their own experiences, and what they passed on through their experience-close narratives and testimonies were troves of deep human understanding about the effects of genocidal violence and radical trauma. But in the post-war generation, and particularly for those of us who grew up in the shadow of the Holocaust, our particular distance and relationship to the traumatic events makes it possible to study them as history and within history, but at the same time with an awareness of the actual lives and human experiences implicit in the facts. I think the second generation is the hinge generation for which this history is not yet abstract. My own deep probe into the past involved delving into the history of Polish Jews, which, in addition to being my own history, is central to our understanding of the Holocaust. The history itself is long and fascinating, and it offers a very rich and complex template for thinking about ethnic and religious coexistence. I don't want to give you an entire lecture on what were in effect 9 centuries of Jewish life in Poland, but just to give you some basic facts. For several of those centuries, Poland had the largest Jewish population of any country in the world and the largest Jewish minority. In the extended periods of what might be called multiculturalism avant la lettre, Polish-Jewish relations assumed a variety of institutional and social forms and went through various phases of conflict and relative harmony, benign indifference, or outbreaks of hostility and conflict. But exceptionally, the Jews in the Polish territories were neither forced to assimilate nor threatened with expulsion. And this allowed them to develop institutions of learning which became the center of religious scholarship for all of European Jewry, but also political forms and arrangements which are still surprising today. To cite just one example, I found it fascinating to study the Council of Four Lands, which functioned in Poland during the Renaissance, and which was in effect a federated parliament of the Jewish minority. I think the closest equivalent today I can think of is the Federated Parliament of Scotland. The Council met several times a year to discuss the affairs of the Jewish polity in Poland and to mediate within its internal conflicts, but also to lobby for its interests with the country's governing powers and to sort out the community's international relations as well. One of the interesting moments in this long narrative came at the end of the 18th century, when Poland was trying to reform all its institutions, and when the proper role of the large Jewish minority became the subject of general debate. In this discussion, there were radical thinkers on both sides, that is, Polish and Jewish, who thought that the only solution to the Jewish question was full assimilation of the Jews, including conversion, and the reform of all Jewish institutions on the Polish model. There were conservatives, on the other hand, who thought that integration of the two peoples was impossible, and that only strict separation would create a tolerable situation. The Polish thinkers of this political stripe thought that there was something about Jewish traditions and character which was inimical to the Polish spirit. The Jewish scholars and rabbis wanted, above all, to preserve their traditions and distinct Jewish identity. They protested against being reformed, re-educated, or forced to speak Polish. But there were also commentators who followed the ideas of the French Enlightenment, again both Poles and Jews, who thought that one could combine integration with identity, that there was a sphere of citizenship which required Jews to speak Polish and come under Polish laws, but that their role as citizens did not preclude a sphere of cultural and spiritual freedom or privacy, a sphere in which Jews could continue to maintain their language, religion, and customs. My sympathies, I must say, are with those Enlightenment thinkers whose ideas are, I think, still relevant today. But as it happened, both their propositions and the entire debate were rendered moot by the partitioning of Poland at the end of the 18th century by the three surrounding powers. And so, as the long centuries of coexistence unfolded, the two communities, two nations, as they were sometimes called, remained culturally and spiritually separate. In the Shtetls, in the small towns, they lived in close proximity to each other and spoke a few words of each other's language. Jewish bands played at Polish weddings, and Polish peasants drank in Jewish inns. But the religious rituals, their beliefs and customs were unknown to each other. On the Polish side, Jews were the object of many superstitions and of religious anti-Semitism, often stoked during Sunday sermons. On the Jewish side, illiterate Polish peasants were often viewed with unspoken scorn and a sense of superiority. Most of the time, the two groups muddled along despite this, and the prejudices against Jewish neighbors were contained within daily interactions and familiarity. But during times of political or economic tensions, the suppressed suspicions of the Jewish minority flared up into episodes of open anti-Semitism and sometimes violence. Both the tensions and the violence reached new levels of intensity during the 1930s and the rise of extreme nationalism. And during the dark time of the Holocaust, the prejudices and the distance between the two groups had tragic consequences. The range of human behavior, as I've already indicated, within Poland varied enormously. But for most people, at the time of ultimate danger, Jews were not thought of as coming naturally within the sphere of Polish concern. They were not thought of as ours. The responsibility of inclusion has to be attributed mostly to the Polish majority and the reactionary nationalism and anti-Semitism of the interwar period. But it has to be acknowledged that during the long history of coexistence, the Jewish minority was not entirely unimplicated in the choice of separateness. It is difficult to derive anything like lessons from a long and complex history, and yet it seems to me that the long narrative of Polish-Jewish coexistence does have something to teach us about the dangers of separateness and what the wonderful sociologist, Polish-Jewish sociologist, Zygmunt Bauman called the production of distance, a process which in some situations can lead to the extreme dehumanization of the other. Bauman was in fact writing about the project of extermination in the Holocaust when he used this phrase, and the kind of bureaucratic depersonalization of relations in which the other ceases to be as human. But since the Holocaust, we have witnessed many other situations in which the production of distance or separateness between neighborly groups has had terrible consequences. In former Yugoslavia, for example, or in India, where Muslim and Hindu communities exist side by side in relative harmony until a political provocation or other tensions trigger explosions of terrible violence. The recurrence of such situations since the Holocaust is an unhappy fact, but one which we need to acknowledge and which brings up certain political, psychological, and ethical questions for which the Holocaust remains a dark template, but which I think still remain to be studied and understood. Questions about the processes of communal violence, how they unfold and whether they can be stopped in time, or how whole groups of ordinary men, not only in Nazi Germany but in Serbia, are turned into perpetrators of brutal atrocities, or the formation of the kind of radical altruism which leads some people to risk their own lives in order to save others. Indeed, the other broadening of perspective, which is open to the post-generation, comes from the possibility of this cross-cultural perspective. For me, this has involved encounters with survivors of other traumatic histories and other second generations, survivors of Hiroshima and their children in Japan, where both generations have to struggle with the wrenching moral legacy of belonging to a nation which perpetrated terrible acts of aggression before being the victims of the most catastrophic aggression themselves. And it turns out, by the way, that the moral parameters of these situations have a great effect on how they're remembered and how their memory is experienced. I have talked with people who have carried the guilt of committing terrible acts during the Cultural Revolution in China, but also with survivors and witnesses of South Africa's apartheid and the Rwandan genocide. In many of these conversations, I was moved to find out how much the body of writing and thinking about the Holocaust helped people to think and reckon with their own terrible experiences. But it is the more recent instances of atrocity, conflicts whose passions still course through the lives of individuals and societies, which bring up the most immediate questions, but also new insights, not only about the causes of internecine violence, but also about what can be done in the aftermath of enormous wrongs, and how riven societies and traumatized persons can find their way towards possible acceptance and reconciliation. From my vantage point, I have observed these recent developments with a more than abstract interest. In some cases, as in Rwanda, where perpetrators and victims often live side by side, the very attempt to devise processes of post-conflict reconciliation is challenging and even painful. But it seems that in all these situations, the reparative element is something which is the moral and psychological opposite of dehumanization, and that is the idea and practice of recognition. Genocide and apartheid are examples of what Primo Levi called gratuitous violence, that is, violence that does not serve the ends of battle or victory, but is meant to humiliate and brutalize the victim and to deny their right to exist. On the collective level, an attack on another group is a denial of that group's identity, cultural ethos, historical version of itself. As after the Holocaust, the losses and psychic wounds attendant on such destruction cannot be undone. But it seems that full acknowledgement of what actually happened, of the victim's experience and the perpetrator's responsibility, can provide at least a symbolic redress which can allow some healing to take place and societies to move on. Individual recognition in such instances is much needed and can be offered by family and friends through the kind of ordinary daily empathy and response which comes from close knowledge and intimacy with another person. It was part, I think, of our education of living with survivors. Or in therapy or psychoanalysis through an examination of deeper subjectivity and the working through of terrible memories. At least this is true in our therapeutic cultures. Elsewhere, rituals of commemoration and mourning may be different and more communal. But just as crucial is the element of more collective or public recognition, which acknowledges what happened to a group of people, and most often because they belong to that group. And of course, public recognition matters profoundly to the inner world of the survivors. When Primo Levi was in Auschwitz, his greatest nightmare was that if he survived, his account of what he experienced would not be believed. And this turned out to be terribly true. He could not get his book published for quite a few years after the war. I also think of the many Holocaust survivors who were deeply hurt by the early and almost universal disavowal of that event and were driven into deeper silence and isolation. On the other hand, the force of such procedures as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, for all its flaws, came from the enactment of the processes of recognition, a formal ritual which enabled the victim to face the perpetrator and to say, this is what happened, this is what I experienced. I will tell my story and it will be heard. In reading accounts of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission testimonies, what is striking is the need of the victim to hear from the perpetrator exactly what happened, to have him, it was almost always him, admit precisely what was done. Did you do that? One of the victims kept insisting. Did you say that? Eventually, the perpetrator admitted that he spoke the awful words the victim had heard. I think I am running a little bit long, so I'm going to try to condense a little bit. But whatever the processes attendant on such encounters, their effects are sometimes very powerful. I was deeply moved, for example, to read the testimony of a man who had been literally blinded in the course of apartheid, and who, after finishing his account, said, "I want to thank the Commission because I now feel, after telling my story, that I have regained my vision." I think what he meant was that his moral world had been righted, his inner clarity had been restored. It seems to me that procedures like the TRC or the peace process taking place in Colombia right now represent an ethical increment in our collective history, and I think they owe a lot to the great body of thought that has been accomplished during the since the Holocaust. A great body of psychoanalytic thought and moral and political thought. However, I'm conscious that in talking about the aftermath of violence, I'm speaking about what might be called, by analogy with the lesser evil, a lesser good. Because it would, of course, be so much better if we could prevent such abuses from occurring in the first place. But in this latter task, as anyone aware of the extravagant atrocities pervading today's world knows, we have so far failed signally. Again, perhaps I say this from my post-Holocaust vantage point, but I must say that I have often felt a sense of impotent outrage as I watched footage of the war in Syria in the last few years with its images of Aleppo, which are so eerily reminiscent of Warsaw in rubble, or the heartbreaking images of wide-eyed children too traumatized to cry, as were the children caught in the photographs of the Warsaw ghetto. In a sense, we know much more about what's going on in Syria. We see it on our television screens every night, or in other outbreaks of horror. Most recently, for example, the prosecutions of the Rohingya minority in Burma, when the witnesses of the Holocaust knew about events then. And yet we, that is the international community, have done nothing to stop some of the worst atrocities of recent years. I understand all the complications and difficulties of intervening in such situations, and yet it seems to me that if the UN and the international community are not to become an entirely ineffectual object of cynicism, something which is in itself dangerous, we need to establish stronger principles of human rights intervention and mechanisms for carrying out responsibility to protect, that is, to protect people who are helpless from the impunity of power, and to intervene in the instances of violence which are not war, but carnage by the stronger of the weaker. After all, the principles of human rights and the concept of genocide were established in the wake of the Holocaust and as a result of the Holocaust, and we need to somehow practice these lessons. But in the long run, and here I want to shift registers perhaps surprisingly and take you back to that conference in Bratislava, it seems to me that if we want to avoid a Hobbesian world, our best stay against it is something to do something more fundamental, and that is to protect and strengthen our contemporary democracies and to establish within them structures of justice and mutual recognition strong enough and inclusive enough to prevent gratuitous violence in the first place. History doesn't repeat itself exactly. If it did, it would be much easier to learn from it. But I often think these days of Sebastian Haffner, a brilliant German journalist who observed events in this country in the 1930s, and who wrote that the rise of Hitler was enabled not by the strength of fascism, but by the weakness of democracy. I don't think we're witnessing the rise of fascism in Europe or the United States, at least I hope not, although we have certainly seen the close possibilities of it elsewhere. Still, the assaults on liberal democracies, both from without and from within, are a cause of great concern, not least because the weakening of these societies leaves a vacuum of those basic international norms against which their increasingly appalling violations in many parts of the globe can be at least judged, if not always acted upon. Here I want to shift to the European and particularly the British context with which I am by now most familiar, and I hope it will not be too distanced from you. And I think perhaps, there are reverberations for the situation in this country as well. In the last few years, we have seen several countries in Eastern Europe turning away from the very idea of democratic freedom for which they had fought so ardently, and the embrace in Poland and Hungary of more authoritarian and more nationalist forms of governance, explicitly named illiberal democracy and accompanied by increasingly open forms of anti-Semitism, as well as the refusal to admit any non-Christian refugees into their midst. At the same time, in Western Europe, in the last few years, we have witnessed the terror not only of Bataclan, but of Nice, Brussels, Manchester, and several times over London, as well as Barcelona more recently. All forms of gratuitous violence directed in these instances not at any particular group or identity, but at democracy itself. In several Western European countries, and perhaps partly in reaction to such attacks, there has been the rise of xenophobic populism, prevented from taking power for now, but chastening in its appeal. And in Britain, of course, we have had Brexit and a recent rise of the still small, but nevertheless troubling alt-right movement in that hitherto very temperate society. Once again, it seems the question of dealing with the other is threatening to fracture and undermine open liberal societies. It does need to be said that the difficulties caused by rapid mass-scale immigration and global movements into small and densely populated European countries cannot be dismissed purely as a figment of the bigoted imagination. The problems caused by global movements or by hundreds of thousands of desperate refugees from conflict zones and failed states, risking their lives in the often vain hope that Europe can save them and deliver better lives for them, or by the free movement within Europe itself, I hope you know what this refers to. These problems are real and they need to be addressed honestly and realistically. But the fundamental problem, it seems to me, is that neither Britain nor many other liberal democracies have found satisfactory forms of coexistence in the face of new circumstances. I think I will just condense what I was going to say because the forms of multiculturalism devised in Britain have proceeded partly from a kind of progressive guiltiness about the history of colonialism, and I think this is echoed in other European countries as well, and partly from a kind of laissez-faire tolerance which says, we'll leave you alone if you leave us alone. This is in many ways a benign idea, and some of the effects of this kind of ethos have, if you move in the professional circles in London, or if you see many interesting and important, Muslim media figures in Britain, you can see that this has had some very benign results. But in most contexts, it has led to great failures of social integration and quite extreme kinds of geographical and social separatism. A variety of groups, sometimes large enough to populate small towns, living in their own enclaves, and often trying to preserve the habits and traditions of their original cultures, even as their countries of origin may be changing out of recognition. This means that the inhabitants of Britain are in danger of existing in a kind of collective ignorance of each other. Majority of the various minorities of the putatively monolithic majority, as well as of each other. It is a form of ghettoization, really, which creates the conditions for conflict and for the perpetuation of social inequalities, and which at times has led to terrible kinds of abuse and sometimes violence from all sides of the multicultural equation. The dangers of systemic separateness, even in this moderate context, are real. And I sometimes think that in Britain, as in other European democracies, it would be good to have truth and coexistence forums in which members of various groups can strive for authentic dialogue and for a full understanding of their cultural differences and their attitudes towards each other. This is not at all easy and involves taking risks and the courage to treat each other as full moral equals. But of course, when cultural differences exist within the borders of one society, there is a third perspective and presence which needs to be taken into account, and that is the perspective of the body politic itself and what can still be perhaps called the common good. From that third but crucial vantage point, the question becomes not only how we can understand each other and all of our differences, but how we can retain a notion of commonality and solidarity in the face of those differences. Again, I'm aware that I'm speaking here in the European context. The problematic in the US may be different. But I am trying to speak from the moment, as you know, and from my vantage point now in relation to that terrible past. But I think that in these newly diverse and increasingly fragmented societies, we need to re-establish strongly the idea of a common sphere in which we can overcome our separateness, forums in which we act primarily as citizens rather than members of a particular group, and in which we can recognize each other as fellow members of the same society to whom we owe the same concern and rights as we owe ourselves. I would like to suggest that in the case of liberal democracies, this does not imply some old-fashioned idea of national greatness or national identity, in which being British or French or Polish is a changeless and monolithic condition, but rather an affirmation of what I would like to call the culture of democracy itself. It seems to me that after several decades of democratic ascendancy and enjoying the most extensive freedoms any contemporary or historical form of governance has had to offer, we have become complacent about the values implicit in democracy and its moral and intellectual foundations. We tend to regard it not in terms of ideas or meanings, but as a system for negotiating among many positions, points of view and perspectives, and above all, economic interests. And of course, it is all that. And yet it seems to me that the very possibility of a democratic society also depends on some profound and powerful underlying principles. Above all, the idea of individual freedom, freedom of conscience and of personal choice, the freedom of each person to think and make moral decisions on the basis of their own internalized values rather than systems of religious or ideological belief, and also the principle of judging others on the basis of their individual humanity rather than membership in a particular group or tribe. In our advanced societies, these ideas may seem self-evident. They're basically the ideas of Enlightenment humanism and human rights. But as we see increasingly in our world, and indeed in our own societies, they can be all too easily endangered. They also involve a set of assumptions about the nature of the person which may be invisible to those who grow up within it, but which makes high demands for and on the individual self. Demands for critical thought, for forming our own moral codes and purposes, for making choices on every level of life, from the practical to the existential, from within and on the basis of our own criteria, rather than guiding codes of tradition or religion. As many immigrants from more traditional cultures can tell you, indeed, as I initially found in my transition from more communal forms of life in Poland to the demands of Western individualism, this is a set of deep assumptions about the self, a sort of psychosocial system which calls for a high degree of internal autonomy and a certain kind of discipline. Different conceptions of the self are often a fundamental dividing line in cross-cultural and cross-religious relations. They were certainly at stake in the Polish-Jewish relationship. the distance between the personal world of the Polish peasant and the Orthodox Jew was great. In today's world, it seems to me that the strenuous demands of individualism and open-ended freedom may to some extent account for the retreat into the unfolding enclaves of family and tradition in some immigrant communities, and at the extreme end of the spectrum for the baffling phenomenon of the European jihadis, often well-educated young men and women from good backgrounds who have detonated deadly devices throughout Europe in the last decades. Whatever the mix of personal motives driving such people, disaffection with their lives, some form of social resentment or some psychological fault line, one thing is clear: in embracing ISIS or other forms of extremism, they're choosing the terrible charisma of an absolutist cause over the demands of individual freedom and the often confusing complexities of democratic choice. Such phenomena have been noted before in that echoing period preceding World War II and the Holocaust. It was Sigmund Freud, as he watched the rise of Nazi extremism in the 1930s, who gave us some of the early and still salient speculations about the dangerous appeal of authoritarian leaders in confusing times and the comforts of subsuming one's own personality, especially for those whose sense of self is undeveloped or insecure, within a larger ideology and group. And it was one of his disciples, Erich Fromm, who, having left Germany after the Nazis took power, wrote his cautionary book, Escape from Freedom, also known as Fear of Freedom, in which he analyzed the appeal of conformity for those with insufficiently developed critical consciousness. Again, history doesn't repeat itself exactly. But I think that in order to counter the seductive appeal of totalizing ideologies, as well as other forms of separateness and disengagement, we need a much deeper initiation for all members of the body politic into the culture of democracy and the personal values it needs and requires. I realize I may sound utopian here, but I think one could do worse than teach philosophy, especially ethics, early on, in order to bolster and deepen the ability to think independently, to engage in dialogue with others not only on the basis of ethnic or religious identity, but of consciousness, to ponder, for example, what justice is, what being free actually means, or how to distinguish facts from wishful thinking. In the era of fake news, the ability to think critically and to distinguish truth from falsehood is, as we know, crucial to the well-being of our polities. And we need spaces in which to develop the capacities for three-dimensional reflection and thoughtfulness, and for the kinds of non-digital conversations which can help us deepen our understanding of others. Here I want to bring in an exemplary figure whose life ended during the Holocaust, but who I think was one of the great Jewish humanists of the early 20th century, and that is Janusz Korczak. Korczak's name, so it was actually the pen name of Henryk Goldschmidt, he was a Polish Jew clearly, is usually associated with his heroic final act. Incarcerated in the Warsaw Ghetto with nearly 200 children from the orphanage he ran, he refused all offers of rescue from his Polish friends, so that he could be with the children till the end and accompany them on their last journey to Treblinka. This was clearly a profound act of radical altruism. But before that, he was, among other things, a doctor, a writer, and above all, an educator and a shaper of young souls. The orphanage he established for Jewish children in Warsaw was run like a microcosmic democracy. The children had their own parliament, newspaper, but also ran their own courts in which they debated transgressions against the school's code and suitable penalties, although these were often leavened by sympathetic understanding of each child's background and inner world. In effect, Korczak was administering an education in practical ethics, in the ethics of justice and empathy, and in ethical psychology, and also how to think and understand other minds. he, by the way, established the principle of the human rights of the child. I think this is the kind of humanism that we need badly in today's democratic societies. We humans are meaning-making, meaning-seeking creatures. The Holocaust was the ultimate attempt to abolish meaning. I don't think we're in danger of being tested in such ultimate ways. But in order to understand why democracy matters and why it deserves our allegiance, we need a discourse not only of economics or procedures, but of ethics, and in order to prevent these worst outbreaks of internecine gratuitous violence. We need to endow liberal democracy with a sense of significance and charisma, which belongs to a purpose and a cause, and to remind ourselves why in our present world it can no longer be taken for granted, but needs to be nurtured and defended. I think we have too often ceded passion to those who would limit both tolerance and freedom. We need to recover it for a progressive understanding of social belonging and humane values. Social belonging in pluralist societies. I think one of our deepest needs is for solidarity, for living in a shared social space with fellow human beings whom we can respect and understand, and to whom we can extend basic trust, if not always agreement. This is the counterpoint and the antidote to the production of distance and dehumanization which can follow from it. It is that sense of commonality we need to develop in order to strengthen our open, pluralist societies. It may be a surprising conclusion, but it seems to me that as we contemplate the Holocaust from our lengthening distance, the need to nurture and strengthen decent, open, liberal societies is, to my mind, the most urgent, tempered lesson which we can derive from the extremity of that history-altering event. Thank you.
Do you think that the rise of the right-wing movements and governments at this point was inevitable in some way?
I don't know what we mean by inevitable. I think things are never inevitable. I think, there are contingencies of history which lead us in a certain direction. But I think one of the reasons for the rise of, the right-wing extremism has been a liberal complacency. And again, I think of the Sebastian Hafner, this German journalist, who did think, that it was liberal complacency which enabled the rise of Hitler. And I think there has been liberal complacency. I think we have assumed, that our progressive liberal values are right. We don't need to defend them. We don't need to think about them. We don't need to think about, other sort of spheres of our societies. And I think, in Britain, certainly, what has happened around Brexit has been a result of sort of culture and class wars. In a sense, I did have a sense of, again, a kind of very inexact repetition of the culture wars in this country in the 1970s.
How do you see the Israeli-Palestinian situation through the lens of your reflection?
I think I'll take a Fifth Amendment on that. It is such a hugely complex situation. And, right now it is so dispiriting and so depressing and so awful. I think it can be distinguished from the situations which I've been talking about in that it has been a political conflict. Among other things, and I think it has been a conflict, I think it is just too vexed and complex to try to, decode it here and to compare it to other situations. Yeah.
Often as we see more and more things happen like Las Vegas and other events, we start to, at least I believe in some cultures, start to see things as the new normal and accept things as a reality that we just have to live with.
I know.
Do you think there's any way we can shake that and avoid becoming just accepting these gun, violence and extremism is just part of the new normal society.
I know. Well, I mean, we are being shaken into renewed kind of sense of shock by, mind you. But yes, there is a normalization of all of this. We need to be aware of what's going on. We do need to be aware of what's going on, and we need to know. In a sense, we need to know what to do. I mean, I think in the European democracies, I think the question is what to do. I think here there has been fortunately a lot of pushback against Trump's kind of, what shall I call them, extreme behavior. Shenanigans, I wanted to say, but there has been serious pushback, and actually he has not been able to accomplish very much of what's on his agenda. And I think here the system of checks and balances is still, I think, very robust and very important. So I think the context here is partly different because there is a very strong notion of American citizenship. And in a sense, American patriotism, I think so, which I don't think, it certainly doesn't exist in Britain. So, what is supposed to, bring people together is a bit less clear. This is why I think, that we really do need to develop a notion of the culture of democracy. Yeah.
Zygmunt Bauman, in his Holocaust and Modernity, talks about certain societal, social safeguards that could prevent another Holocaust to happen. And he, at one point, focuses on the question of the divided responsibility in the way we execute our prisoners in this country. And he says that this principle of divided responsibility, where 7 people participate, or 6 people, 5 participate in killing a guilty prisoner, is definitely just a weakening of those safeguards that our society should have produced. And what are your thoughts about this?
Yes, I mean, there are certain aspects of American democracy which are quite exceptional, shall we say. I mean, the gun laws are exceptional, the death penalty is exceptional, and they are a very strange aspect of this democracy. And of course, I would be so much happier if they didn't exist. And there is, of course, a great debate going on about it. I think that is a weakening of solidarity, certainly, and a weakening of a democratic fabric. Yeah.
Can I ask you a little bit more about the culture of democracy itself that you're exploring, and to ask maybe especially about those places in society that you see as opportunities for building unity, building democratic connections. In the American context, we might think of arenas like public education in primary and secondary schools.
Yeah.
But there are other possibilities too that are either related to government or to civil society. So can you talk more about that culture of democracy itself?
Yeah. Well, first of all, education is hugely important, of course, and if it were up to me, I would favor abolishing of faith schools in Britain. There are, faith schools, and some of them actually do inculcate their, pupils into quite extreme forms of Islam, for example. But I'm happy to say that there are now projects to teach philosophy in schools to very young children, and I, visited one of those lessons, and it was wonderful. It was, really inspiring and really wonderful. And one of the things that was wonderful about it is that these kids, they were 11 years old. There were black kids and white kids, and girls in hijabs. It didn't matter. What mattered was what they thought, and what sort of thoughts and arguments they brought in to the particular problem they were discussing. I mean, there is a whole sort of there is certainly a lot of talk about community engagements, and I think those should be very much strengthened. And there should be communal events, common communal events. Excuse the frivolity, but I think dance groups. I mean, I'm thinking of this partly because when I visited the village, the Shtetl from which my parents came, somebody remembered that there were, Saturday dances at which Jews and Poles and Ukrainians danced together. But yes, I mean, more seriously, I mean, the sort of the grassroots governance there is very strong. I mean, the councils, the city councils could institute conversations, inter-communal conversations, which would be authentic, because I think authentic dialogue is very hard to come by. Which would be an honest interchange. I think that would be very good, for example. So, yeah.
Thank you. It's kind of like a follow-up question, I think. I'm not sure how to phrase it. But you kind of brought up two separate things, right? Because you said that if you could, you thought they should abolish religious schools in Britain.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, you were talking about communities meeting with each other, like different communities meeting. So I wasn't sure if you're against like segregated communities or communities that maintain their a different language maybe or different customs, and you want them to meet, or do you want like the communities to not really exist to begin with?
I want the communities to meet. I am absolutely against segregation. I think, education is crucial in inculcating people into the shared society. People can have their Sunday schools or their Saturday schools or whatever. They can also, have, maintain their religion, certainly, or their cultural customs insofar as they wish, or for as long as they wish, in their private lives. But we also absolutely need these shared spaces. We absolutely do. I mean, because, the results of the segregation are becoming more and more dire. I mean, I could give you examples, but perhaps I won't, but they really are. And it's, it's just not sufficient to the occasion, not sufficient to our circumstances now, to have all of these, separate enclaves, separate whole towns,
Gone back to Europe before like the 30s or the 40s, before that even, would you, I don't know, have preferred that the Jewish towns wouldn't have existed and those communities would have been?
I would have favored something which a certain segment of the Jewish population by that time was absolutely favoring, which was education in Polish language, and also observing to some extent the sort of the laws were still being designed by Jewish communities, but I think observing the common laws of the country would have been very important.
I'm curious what it's like to be a European Jew today and how European Jews are able to balance and reconcile their European citizenship and feelings of nationalism, let's say, with the country they live in with their identity as a Jew. Just, for example, my family came from Germany and they escaped to South America, and I think in years since never returned and never retained that feeling of European identity. So what does the future look like for European Jewry in that regard?
Well, of course, you know, Jews are not natural Europeans. You know, they have had an international identity. So, you know, that in a sense is no problem. The problem is the rise of anti-Semitism in various countries, and particularly politically correct anti-Semitism. I mean, this, I must say, has been a very vexing, you know, problem for me in Britain, because for quite a while there really was politically correct anti-Semitism, sort of associated, you know, with leftist views about Israel and Palestine. And of course one wants, you know, progressive attitudes towards that, but the two things got very mixed up. And it really became the one permitted form of prejudice for a while. It was the permitted form of prejudice. And by the way, it is once again becoming a permitted form of prejudice in Poland and Hungary, and this makes me immeasurably sad. In Britain, it is now changing for the better in that it is being acknowledged as a problem, and I think acknowledgement, you know, is very important. So, yeah.
Could you please elaborate on the following? The model in Germany and the model of the Shtetl are two completely different models.
Yeah.
In Germany, there was almost full integration and assimilation.
Yeah.
In the Shtetl was the opposite.
Yeah.
And both suffered the same way.
I don't think, you know, that both suffered in the same way shows that both were equally untenable in a way. I mean, in other words, you know, the project of extermination was a Nazi project, and it extended to German Jews and to Shtetl Jews. In other words, you're saying what could save us? I mean, you know,
the anti-Semitism in Poland was not less than in Germany.
No, I think for many centuries it was a very different form of coexistence. I mean, in fact, you know, Polish Jews were not forced to assimilate as German Jews were to a large extent. And no, I mean, so no, I don't think it was the same kind of anti-Semitism. You know, the project of the Holocaust project was a German Nazi project. Why it arose in that culture is another question, and why it could be, you know, executed from that culture is another question. And I think I was recently at an event which was a conversation with the son of Hans Frank, who was the Governor General of Poland for the Nazi regime during the war and the Holocaust. And the question came up: how could this happen in Germany? How could, you know, how could the population of Germany go along with this? And his answer was, I think, you know, the most, in a way, a very simple, but to me a very convincing answer. It was a lack of civic courage, and perhaps a certain culture of authoritarianism, you know, which sort of prevailed in the family and in other institutions. Yes, I mean, I don't think, you know, that one can give kind of very definite answers to this, but yeah. I don't think it was, you know, in other words, I don't think that this proves that Shtetl existence was as unfortunate as German existence, or vice, whatever you were implying, yeah.
do you have any thoughts about how the history of Jewish sites is being preserved in this age of tourism? And I'm thinking of opening up the Anne Frank house to massive tourism. Auschwitz, you know, more. I was at Auschwitz last year, and I've never seen so many selfies.
Yeah, I know.
And you know, people thinking about Poland in kind of Fiddler on the Roof terms. Do you have any thoughts on what's the best way to kind of preserve a more authentic, if possible, vision of history?
My thought is that I don't love it, of course. I don't love, you know, the sort of the Holocaust tourism. But in a way, I don't think it's our greatest worry at the moment. I think, you know, the way to counter that would be to prepare people who go into these places by some, you know, some kind of educative process in what happened there and what the places are about. I mean, that might be one way to do it.
Expand on the Jewish people in Europe, because when people pass here, what are the things that can be done for their essence as people of Germany and people of England? What do you have to say about all the other places where Jews don't exist at all? The number one Germanic Jews, you have people in England, and then you have the last that are in France, and all the rest of the communities, they disappear. So how can you talk about, or what can you say about how to remember the heritage or what Jews can do?
There are certain inevitabilities in history, I'm afraid. And, you know, the passage of this past from memory to history is going to happen. It will be remembered as history, you know, it will have to be conveyed as history. You know, I mean, we cannot preserve the Jewish population in Europe artificially.
But there is some revival of Jewish populations, both in Poland and also.
Well, this is true.
In
Yes,
Germany.
yes. I mean, I don't know if you're talking about the decrease in population simply.
There are non-existence. When you have 200 people that are elderly people,
Yes.
that have mixed marriages,
Yes.
no children. In Krakow, you have as an example, everyone, when you go to Krakow, the people that are there serving and making the klezmer for the tourists,
Yes.
those are students from the university, nothing to do with Jews. They are non-Jews. So, and still you have kosher meals, because you have two Israelis that you have one serving the milk and the other serving the
Look, yes, no. But, you know, what would you suggest? I mean, we cannot import, you know, Jews from Israel to come to Krakow. But at the same time, as Bożena was...
There is a festival.
There is a great,
festival in Krakow. Have you attended it? It's, you know, it's a marvelous moment when people from the entire world go there, and sometimes till the early mornings they
No.
share.
There has been a real revival of Jewish life, you know, against all odds. Jewish schools, Jewish, you know, publications, and, you know, this festival. So, you know, in other words, there is a much greater consciousness within there was, until, you know, this new government took over, of the Jewish past and the Jewish history, in a great attempt to sort of preserve, in fact, you know, Jewish sites and to teach Jewish history, and in some cases to teach Yiddish and Hebrew to, you know, kids in high school and at universities. So there has been that revival of consciousness, but I'm afraid you cannot restore the Jewish population of Poland. You know, this is the tragedy we are dealing with. Yeah.
We have time for one more.
Okay, one more
Sorry.
question.
What do you think about, especially after the war, the sort of shifting of Jewish identity into a more religious framework focused on Hebrew, focused with, Chabad expanding everywhere, and especially Hebrew over Yiddish is being seen more as a central part of Jewish identity. So how do you think that affects the way, maybe not the second generation, not the immediate post-war generation, but like the third generation, the ones that are growing up with this kind of going to Hebrew school or whatever? How do you think that affects the way that generation will remember the war and the Holocaust, and how that will be sort of projected outward?
That's a very interesting question. And by the way, there is a third generation phenomenon among other immigrant groups,
exactly. The language gets lost in the third generation.
What?
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
The which generation?
Oh, yes, the language gets lost in the third generation. So there's memory, there's post-memory, and then what happens?
Yeah, but I mean, among the Muslim populations, in Europe, for example, there is the very same phenomenon. There is, there is a phenomenon of third generation literature, which is beginning to sort of, come up. So I think there is enormous interest, in the third generation, and partly because often there was a kind of missed transmission in the second generation. Whether it will be remembered differently or what they will bring to it, will they bring a more religious consciousness to it? I don't know yet, but it's a very interesting question.
There are refreshments, a small reception right outside, and I know that Dr. Hoffman will be here. Please feel free to continue the conversation. But last and not least, let's thank Dr. Hoffman.